Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. Today's host will be the Krulak Center's own China SME, Mr. Dan Rice, who's been on the Brutecast several times at this point. Dan's been busy since we last spoke with him, recently publishing a China Maritime Studies Institute note on Chinese carrier battle groups, and earlier this year he published a longer research paper on the People's Liberation Army Naval Coastal Defense Missile Force. Dan, thanks for joining me on the podcast, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kiwi. And yeah, the title's a mouthful, so it is what it is. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I'm very excited because I'd like to welcome my friend Chris Pultz to the show. Chris, welcome.
Thank you.
So Chris is a retired lieutenant colonel, former China Foreign Area Officer with over 20 years of China and Taiwan-related experience within the military, government, and academia. He currently works for Booz Allen Hamilton as an instructor for the China Way of War. And during his active duty years, he served in various strategic positions to include Assistant Army Attaché to Mongolia, Chief for the China Military Capabilities Branch, Defense Intelligence Agency, Senior China Advisor to the Chief of Staff for the U.S. Army, and Assistant Professor of Chinese Language at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. In his post-service time, Chris has served as the Senior China Advisor for the National Intelligence Manager, the NIM, for East Asia, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and as the Senior China Analyst for Special Operations Command Pacific. So Chris, over to you for any introductory remarks you want to make.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Krulak Center for inviting me today. This is a great opportunity to really dive deep into an area that I'm excited to talk about today, and that is the role of the Chinese Communist Party in governance inside China. And I think this is a great opportunity to bring this knowledge and exploratory discussions we're going to have today to the senior officers and NCOs in the Marine Corps. I look forward to our discussion, and thank you again, Dan, for allowing me to come in and give my views on my experience and knowledge of Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I'm really excited, Chris, because I know this is a topic that it's kind of hard to get into if you're looking from the outside. There's some difficulty in getting information. There's also just the general difficulty of understanding like how a government or how a nation governs, right? It's a pretty complicated topic, but I know you've been looking at this really closely, so we're going to have some excellent deep dives on some of these issues. Just to kind of level set us for the audience here, and in the last episode of this series, we spoke with Dr. Christopher Young, the Dean of McWar, or the Marine Corps War College, about the difference between the CCP, the PLA, and the CCP. And we also talked about some of the history of the Chinese Communist Party and the leadership and how the leaders' thinking changes over time. So if you didn't have a chance to check out that conversation, I strongly encourage you to go give it a listen, and that will help frame some of the discussion for today. So today, like Chris mentioned, we're going to continue on this theme of understanding Chinese governance, but put it more in the modern context. So just a little bit of background here. We say CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, but that term communist really is quite loaded, right? You could think of the Soviet Union, the Red Scare, a variety of different things that are attached to the term communist. Today, I don't really want to focus on the term as much as I want to focus on how the CCP as the party that governs China actually functions, right, in the modern context, and how their leadership trickles down to other things, like we mentioned in the PLA and the PRC, the administrative portion of it. So, as we're thinking about this, it is very, it's somewhat of an understudied topic. It's not exactly the biggest, most juicy prize to dive into, but it's super critical for us to understand when we're thinking about how China approaches policy and strategy, and really how some of the things that they do today reflects what we see in the news. So really putting that, what you see in the news in context. So with that in mind, let's dive right in. So, Chris, as I mentioned last time, we defined the CCP, PLA, and PRC in a broad way. So let's get into some specifics. The CCP is a top-down structure, meaning that the top leadership sets that strategic vision and it trickles down through the levels of the party and the state. But saying that goes only so far. So what does that system actually look like? If you could, can we start at the top and move our way down the ranks? And let's start off with the CCP. How is that structured?
Well, thanks, Dan. And I kind of like to start off with before we any time you hop into understanding the structures and the governance of the Chinese Communist Party with the CCP. It's important to understand a little bit about the demographics
Yeah.
of the party itself. And I like to kind of give a reflection, because a lot of people, when you're trying to understand how China's governed, you really need to understand a little bit about the party itself. We know, and you may have discussed in the past, the history of the party going back to 1921, and the formulation of the party and the grassroots nature of the party and where it came from. But if we look at it today, a snapshot of the party demographics of 2023, we're looking at a party in China that consists of 99 million members, and that's as of 2023. And with that, 5.1 million grassroots organizations within the party that make up 30% of the party is female. 7.7% of the party makeup is of minority groups within China. 56% are college graduates. 82% are under the age of 35. And yet it's a party that continues to grow. And it is a party that has attracted 2.4 million people in 2023 alone, and it continues to grow. But it is the party that runs almost every aspect of life in governance of China today.
So let's tease that out a little bit, because those are some really interesting figures, right? We're looking at less than 10% of the population. Public math shouldn't do it, but I believe that's somewhere around 7%, and 30% female. So majority male. You also said a heavy amount under the age of 35, right?
Yes, 82%.
82%. So we have a young, predominantly male, about 56% is what I think you said, with college education, meaning 44% not, and representing a very small portion of the overall population. So that leads to a situation in which, a lot of times you hear, at least in CCP official documents, that they're really about representation of the overall people. But that doesn't quite add up, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And do we see some effects of that in terms of when they're trying to represent larger populations? Are there areas that might not have as much representation, beyond the gender ratio there?
I think if you look at the statistics, and these are statistics reported by the organizational department of the CCP, you're looking at 7.7% from minority groups. So you look at kind of a very small percentage of representation from those groups, and there's a multitude of minority people and minority groups in China that are underrepresented by the party. But the party isn't necessarily there to represent, and I think that's a key takeaway. The party serves a purpose that really dates back to its founding days, and I'll say the two ingredients for the party. How does it maintain control? How does it, when we look at our country as we're a representative kind of governance, theirs is a very vertical, centralized control system, but it really focuses on two things: one, organization, and two, mobilization. And this is what has really allowed the party to succeed, and not only achieving and winning the Civil War from their perspective in 1949 and the standing up the People's Republic of China, but also to today's modern China. And the narrative that they carry is that they have succeeded and won in carrying the mandate of and upholding the four cardinal principles, which is the core of the party beliefs in leading China today.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I want to get into how that works, right? My quick comment that I want to throw out there is, I think you said around 7% of the party is minority, and so thinking a little bit bigger picture here, when we're thinking about things like Xinjiang or Tibet, right, Xizang, and some of the other ethnic minority issues that occur within China. I mean, some of that seems like it might stem from an underrepresentation within the party, right?
Right.
So it's just kind of an interesting thing to wrap your mind around when you're thinking of what these different ethnic groups have in terms of representation in, like what you're saying, is a very strategic leader and strategic ideology or planning-led organization. So not to get too far into that, because I'm sure there's entire conversations on that itself. But let's talk about that now. When you're saying they're really meant there to lead, what does that leadership look like in terms of the structure that we're looking at? How many people are involved in that process?
Well, it's interesting. When you think of, and I always like to start off with, when everyone likes to compare and contrast, but I say, the party structure itself is very much a pyramid in shape, if you could visualize it. Unlike our U.S. federal system, where we have checks and balances between the judiciary, legislative, and executive branch, and power is shared. In China, it's the opposite. It's a centralized unitary system. And then I said before, think of it as a pyramid. At the very, very top, you have what is known as the core leader. And that core leader presides over the party, the state, and the military. And that core leader currently today is Xi Jinping. He is chairman of the Communist Party of China. And that is one of the many roles that he occupies. His second is that of the chairman of the Central Military Commission, and his third leading role is the leading of the state. As in other words, we would look at it. Well, he's the president of China. So you can see the three roles that he occupies at the very, very top. But the most important is that he governs and sits as the chairman of the party. And from there, we go down to lower structures. And I'm going to talk really about the five most important structures below him. So below him is the Politburo Standing Committee with 7 members. It is technically the highest political body of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Top decision-making body within the CCP. In this organization, they develop policy directives, provide feedback on policy implementation, and they meet quite frequently. And there are 7 members that play a key role in that Politburo Standing Committee.
So you're saying 7, but that number changes over time, doesn't it?
It does, and it evolves based on the guidance from the core leader, and also deliberations during the party congresses in terms of what they are looking for structure. And so it's not always 7. I believe it was 9. I think as it's up to 9 and maybe more earlier in the early years, but 7 is the current number.
So really, at least the PSC, the Politburo Standing Committee, that's really like the almost like a cabinet. Though I don't like to glom on our institutions over there, but let's call it the advisory core for the core leader, right?
Yes.
They're the ones leading different directions, different departments and bureaus of the overall organization that execute things like internal discipline inspection, party ideology, things like the economy, right? These big buckets.
Yeah,
Go
ahead.
I was going to ask, do we see foreign policy in the PSC?
What we see, if you were to really take a look at the PSC today, it's really 7 key members. And those 7 members, and you bring up a good point, they sit around really core cabinet level like positions that oversee things such as party affairs, propaganda, mass organizations, legislature, the economy, United Front, supervision, and anti-corruption. But you don't see any cabinet members at that level, at the PSC level, that oversees the military or foreign affairs or judiciary. So a large chunk of this body is responsible for the most important political aspects of China's governance. And that includes those functions of personnel organization, propaganda, the mass organizations, the economy, supervision, and anti-corruption, and then the united front of bringing the unity to the party.
Yeah, the United Front one is very loaded, and there's a lot, maybe an entire episode that we can do to pick that one apart. But to be crystal clear here for our audience as well, we're talking right now about the CCP, so the party structure at the very top. And so as so far we've got the chairman, and then general secretary, really chairman, kind of honorary title, and then you've got the Politburo Standing Committee. So Chris, what's at the next level down from the PSC at that 7 members? What are we looking at there?
The next level is the 25-member Politburo, and the Politburo is a little bit larger organization, and it includes the state leaders, the ministries of government, bodies that report to the National People's Congress. And in here, you also include some military members of the Central Military Commission, which we'll get into a little bit later. But the CMC, this is where we see the military actually participating at the highest level of government is seated in this particular organization. So the Politburo is really where we see the blending of state and party and military within the organizational structure.
And how about key municipalities? Is this where some of those key municipality party leaders fall?
That is correct. So, and that's a good point. The key localities, this is the municipalities in China, and that includes Tianjin, Liaoning, Guangdong, Shanghai. And so these key localities are very, very important because the party leadership, or I should say the secretary of these party organizations within these key localities are situated inside this organization.
So at the Politburo level, we see, like you suggest, this true blending, including some of what we could call those core drivers of economic growth or even external outreach. I'm thinking specifically of Shanghai here. Probably a little biased there, but just thinking about how having the one of the key or tier one cities, as we call them, the leader of that party represented within that Politburo is fairly important for coordinating different strategic level initiatives put out by that PSE, right?
Absolutely. And they have to be part, because when we get into the economic planning and we get into the integration of party in terms of guiding economic planning, key localities are absolutely indispensable to that. So they have to be part of that process and have to be a part of the leadership structure.
So what's after the Politburo then, Chris?
Well, let's take it down to really the base for that is the Central Party Committee. And I make the argument, though not everyone agrees, but really this is, for my perspective, is where the core and power of the party lay at. This is where policy, law, regulations, and leadership decisions are really made, not only in the day-to-day running of the party activity, but also involved critically I should say, critical decisions involved future planning, budget, all the mechanisms of the party apparatus and decisions are really made here, including how they elect the members above them. So from the Central Party Committee come the selections for the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee from this particular body. It's also home to many of the key commissions and small leading groups that the leadership is often involved in those long-term plans and also day-to-day activities of party.
So you mentioned, small leading groups. Being a little bit of an insider, those things are pretty important, right? What are there any specific small leading groups that you might be able to point to just to demonstrate to the audience, like what do these things actually do?
They are, and I will say, Xi Jinping has really taken them to the next level, as he chairs quite a few of the small leading groups. But these small leading groups are bodies that really lay down strategy and policy outlines for the party. So an example of one is the small leading group for cyber strategy. There's also a small leading group for MilCiv integration. There's also for national security. So these small leading groups are very important because this is where the nation really steers itself and develops its national strategy across all the different dime structure, if you want to look at that, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. These small leading groups concentrate developing the policy and guidelines that then filter into the Central Party Committee in formulating their plans for the future.
And to take it one step further there, right? Well, you mentioned kind of in passing, but Xi Jinping sits on a lot of these small leading groups. And you just discussed the different structures. So if he's at the top, he's supported by the Politburo Standing Committee, which is again supported by the Politburo. The people in that central committee, that larger body, kind of, I don't want to call them down in the bottom of the barrel because they're very high leaders in the CCP, but there's a lot of them, right? And there's only so much time in the day for Xi Jinping to get a touch point with the people that are actually executing some of the strategy or formulating it. So it seems like that is another way in which Xi Jinping can get direct contact with some of the members on these small leading groups and really put his stamp and his thought into what they're doing, right? Getting an update on some of the big projects that he's got in mind.
Absolutely. He has to be, and you will see that almost every document that's ever produced or speech that is made will always refer to Xi Jinping thought, Xi Jinping guidance. He has to be involved in many, many of these important, especially things that he really, in terms of when he came to power in 2012, in guiding China to where it is today. He has been involved in almost every important small leading group that has put China economically, militarily on the map.
So you mentioned at least at some level, this central committee is responsible for electing the people on the higher up groups, right? Organizations. So let's talk about that for a little bit, because I know before this, before we started recording this, we mentioned the National Party Congress. So there is at least, take it with a grain of salt. But the CCP does like to say, hey, we're somewhat democratic, right? Again, yeah, the definition there is a little shaky, especially based on the demographics that you gave us earlier. But how does that work, right? Like, what does that National Party Congress look like? And what might those elections even look like? So how do we even come up with, how do we build from the base of that pyramid up to the peak?
Yeah, I think that's important. And a lot of people, I mean, you'll see every few months you're going to see in the Chinese newspapers in Xinhua or People's Daily, you're going to see this broadcasted political events in Beijing, and you're always wondering, what is this? You got a National Party Congress, now we got a National People's Congress, and now what's the difference? And why are all these? What do these meetings mean? And it really starts. And I always like in China, everything starts at the party, and I think it's important we start there. Because the Party Congress really is that core center, the base of what keeps the process moving. And I want to talk a little bit about the Party Congress cycle, and just to kind of caveat that and start off with that the Party Congress is the leading organization of the party. It serves as both a body and an event. And what I mean by that is currently they are in the 20th Party Congress, and they meet every 5 years in this what is known as the National Party Congress. And you'll often see it again in the newspapers where large, up to 3,000 delegates come together in Beijing into the Great Hall of the People, and in there they vote. And you look at what are they voting on, and what role do they play? Well, the 3,000 delegates come from all over China. We go back to that party demographics I started off with at the beginning. We've got 99 million members. It's a lot. But for the Party Congress, you've got up to 3,000 delegates. Think about 3,000 delegates coming to Washington and occupying a large building there to basically map out the leadership, the economic plans, all of the things that are going to happen in the next, 5 years, in the next 5-year party cycle, as we call it. And these delegates come from all over China. There are approximately 38 electoral units, and they're chosen on the committees, from the committees that are basically work all the way down to the very local level. And when I mean local level, I'm talking about grassroots levels, townships, neighborhoods. And then from there, you go up to provincial party committees. And so those committees select the leadership, select the delegates to go to the National People's Party Congress. And you think, wow, that's great. They've got a nice grassroots democratic come together, we vote, and then these people go. However, the votes are generally done behind closed doors within those standing committees, provincial and municipal, and even the neighborhood committees are not visible to the public until the delegates are chosen, and then they're then sent up to participate in the National Party Congress.
Yes, and it goes back to the very lowest level party organs that you were discussing earlier too. And while there is some semblance of, local voting or local participation, it absolutely seems like it can be, and probably for the most part is controlled at the lower level, which has that trickle up effect, right?
Mhm.
So you mentioned also the cycles, National Party Congress being
Yes.
that big group meets every 5 years for the CCP, and then National People's Congress that meets every 5 years as well. I think, what is it, 4 or 5 months later? Um, Fast maths, 5 months later.
Mhm.
And then what are they in charge of doing? The People's Congress specifically.
Well, yeah, let me, the People's Congress is, um, again, and if you read their constitution, it is the highest organ of state power in China. And that's a little different
Yeah,
than what you read when we talk about party power. We're talking about state power.
right.
And again, this is about um, the separation between party and state. But I don't want to say it's a separation, it's an integration. And so the NPC represents the highest organ of state power. It's a permanent body of that is called the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. And this organization basically exercises legislative power of the state. And it decides on the following selection of the premier of the state council, the nominations and the president of the PRC, selection of the vice premiers, state councilors and ministers, and selection of the Supreme Court, the People's Court, and prosecutor general. And again, very similar to the party Congress, they are selected from 35 electoral units, or a little bit different, but 35 electoral units from people's congresses of the provinces, the autonomous regions, municipalities, directly under the central government. And their authority is a little different. They do things such as amending the Constitution, supervising the enforcement of the Constitution, make and amend basic laws governing civil and criminal offenses, the state organ management, examining and approving the national economic plans. They basically do the functions of keeping the lights on and keeping the system going. It's the bureaucratic side of the house in China. So as you can see, there's two systems. You've got a party Congress, and then you've got a National People's Congress that does the day-to-day management and execution of the plans that have been approved by the party and the party leadership.
I think there's some nuance here too, right? And I say that because, if you just look at them separately and you say National Party Congress, it's the CCP. Got it, right? Like they're the ones that select the Central Committee and the Politburo and the PSC. And then you
Right.
go over to the People's Congress, and that's for the PRC, for the largely administrative, policy check and constitution, taxes, right? And then we say they elect that the top level of the state body, but there's there's there is overlap, like you're saying, integration here, in which, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but in the party Congress, some of those top positions are slated for individuals that gets reconfirmed or, officially implemented in that National People's Congress. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the purpose here is to from the governance perspective, it broadens the involvement of the Chinese people in the governance process. But it's also important to understand is that you're going to see many similar people in these positions. So party positions and state positions. what I call institutional bridging, in which they integrate. You will see dual-hatted positions sometimes, but you'll also see key members of the state council are also part of the Politburo, are also members of the Politburo. So the party is never out of step, and I should say the state is never out of step with the party.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to just quickly add, or I guess ask this question. Right, dual-hatted party and the state council and other organs of that state administrative function. Do you have to be a party member to be part of the Chinese government or work for the Chinese government?
You do not. You do not have to be a party member. Does it help? Of course, but there are no requirements. And not everyone on the National People's Congress, the NPC, are party members.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's, I always, and one of the questions I always get in our China Way of War sessions is, the assumption that all People's Liberation Army officers are party members, and that is not true. Not every PLA officer is a party member. Not every NBC, National People's Congress member is a party member.
So I think that's the perfect segue, being cognizant of time here. But I think we tackled the CCP structure pretty well, the PRC structure pretty well. But let's talk about the PLA structure, right? You just mentioned that not every PLA officer has to be a CCP member. So how is it structured? And after we talk about that, let's discuss, since not everybody is a party member, how do we align all these things? But let's start with the PLA first. Can you dive into a little bit of how that looks top down?
Yeah, the PLA structure, and I always, we start at with anything in a socialist or Leninist organization, there's always a central committee, there's always a commission, there's always a kind of a centered top body that we need to start with. In this case, we really look at the Central Military Commission, and it's interesting because when we talk about the PLA military, you're never too far out of step with the party, because the PLA is a party army. And that's always very important. And I tell my students to remember that, and that's very foremost in their minds, is that it is a party army. It is subordinate to the party. It was developed to protect the party. It's not a national army. It's not subordinate to the state council. It is subordinate to the party. And the highest ranking member of the People's Liberation Army, the Central Military Commission, is the chairman of the Central Military Commission, Xi Jinping. And you can see the dual-hatted nature of the leadership, the party leadership, very, very much involved in military affairs. And in fact, if you go down from the general secretary to the political, the PSC to the Politburo, and then you go to the Central Committee, the CMC is actually listed as one of the key commissions that the Central Committee is involved in. And that's why we see members from the CMC as part of the Central Committee and in the Politburo as well. So again, that lockstep integration of party and army. Very important to understand. And I also say this to my students, is that when we think about the PLA military, think of it, the PLA military is a political organization with a wartime mission.
I love that line. I think it's incredibly accurate, right? Even with strategy formulation, it makes a lot of sense. So we have we've talked CMC a little bit with the chairman, the CMC being Xi Jinping. What about the vice chairs? And then maybe even beyond that, what does the rest of the organization look going
Well,
down?
it's interesting because if you look at, and I always find it challenging because the Central Military Commission has undergone significant transformation since 2016.
Yeah.
And that was led by Xi Jinping and what we call the Xi Jinping military reforms. Really, a transformation of the military organization from the top all the way to the bottom. And prior to this organization, the Central Military Commission really looked like a gigantic behemoth, even probably 3 to 4 times the size of our Pentagon. But it consisted of these first level departments, gigantic departments, the General Staff Department, the General Political Department, the General Logistics Department, and the General Armaments Department. Gigantic fiefdoms that basically had their own ecosystems for policy coordination and control, and mostly staffed by PLA ground force officers. But if you noticed in there, I mentioned a general political department, the GPD. And again, so you're even within the PLA, the political department, the political organization is critical in ensuring that the party or the army maintains its status of supporting the political goals and objectives of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned it. Number one, those general departments, they shifted around after the reforms, and maybe maybe it's actually worth a full episode just to dive into those reforms. But again, being cognizant of the time here, when we're looking at these three things, how are they coordinated? And when I say these three things, I mean the party, the state, and the military. How are they coordinated? And then also, I know we had a discussion, I think is very pertinent, the political work department within the PLA.
Yeah.
How, like, what are the origins of that? And then how does that support maybe some of that planning function, or does it have its own thing that own function that it runs?
And it's interesting because after the reforms, and again, we could devote a whole episode to that, but
Yeah, I think we will.
we had the creation, the GPD basically goes away and becomes the political work department within the Central Commission, Military Commission. And with that was the establishment of a Discipline Inspection Commission that also oversees the political work department. And in that, the political work department is, and I do want to step back a little bit and say, the organization of political work across all governance in China is layered, and that is they reflect the higher headquarters all the way down. So within the political work department, if you go down into the theater commands, into the components and the services and the arms, you're going to have a reflection of the political work departments and committees all the way down throughout the military, all the way down to the company level. And it's very important for the military to ensure that every soldier, every sailor, every air and rocket force member understands Xi Jinping thought, political thought, understands the role of the party, understands the importance of the party and the party's primacy in their day-to-day activities. It's not just we have a political work department. We have political work that's done every day in each service, all the way down to the company level.
And there's alignment too, I believe, between the political work departments at Echelon. And that gets into a whole another topic of the political commissar. But let's not jump into that quite yet. as I'm sure the audience is aware, each time you touch on something that's unique to the Chinese system or relatively unique, there's a whole conversation that can be had about it, that could take days just to really fully explore. So
Yeah,
I wanna pull us back up. We've
sure.
been in the weeds a little bit, and all goodness, but let's talk about how these this strategy or these different buckets of governance are aligned, right? And what I'm really talking about here is that concept of 5-year plans. Can you explore that for us?
Sure. In China and within the Communist Party, the 5-year planning cycle really dates back to 1953. And really what it is in a nutshell, um, it is medium and long-term planning across party, state, and military areas, and they formulate into what is known as China's 5-year plans. Um, and it's in these 5-year plans that they establish the priorities and are critical and the central means of organizing policy in China. And they have been shaping China since 1953. And now currently we're in the 14th 5-year plan today. And so these plans, again, are generated during key meetings within the party cycles. So for instance, the fifth plenum of the 19th Party Congress is where they laid out the guidelines for the 14th 5-year plan, which is running now, and it started in 2021 and it runs through 2025. So that fifth plenum session is where they laid the foundation. And from there, it was then transferred to um, the party central committee for approval. And then from there, it was then put together and formulated into a larger construct of a very kind of a highly centralized planning and a coordination document that goes out from there to the National Party Congress for approval. And so this cycle began in the previous 13th 5-year plan to get them ready to go into the 14th 5-year plan. And in that, they laid out strategies, policies, laws. All of that gets bundled into that 5-year plan and then approved by the National Party Congress. Once that is approved by the Party Congress, then it goes to the National People's Congress for approval for national budgeting and plans, and then that gets published and then sent down through the bureaucracy, primarily the state council, the NDRC within the state council, the National Development and Resource Commission, then publishes that guidelines, and that goes down across all sectors of China's economy, military, public sector, governance, and it includes all of the things that the state council then have to manage during that 5-year plan, to include security, budget, foreign policy, strategic plans, military guidelines. And then as they go through that 5-year planning, the leaders of the state council will then come back and report to the National People's Congress on how they're doing on that plan.
Yep.
So it is a very long, drawn out process, but deliberate.
And this is a couple things that I'm going to latch onto that you mentioned. You said published, right? Which they publish this, and you can find it without getting too far into the weeds. You can find it out there in the interwebs, and it goes into a lot, as you've suggested. It goes into everything imaginable in some level of detail. And if you want to kind of capture the essence of these 5-year plans and seed it in a way that you can understand, for our audience here, is that a lot of times when you see things like inflated numbers, or you see maybe the term corruption thrown around in terms of things are not really going as expected or as planned within a locality within China. And these things hit the popular news cycle quite frequently. A lot of that comes back to when you're looking at a 5-year plan and you're pegging a target, you're saying, hey, in the next 5 years, we're going to accomplish this level of economic growth. And, funny enough, I was diving into, I think it was the special plan for civil aviation. There's a no kidding target for how many people will have a private pilot's license, right? Down to the number. And so if you've got that level of detailed planning in a 5-year plan in a special area of it, there's a quota to meet. And so you've got to, at the local level, participate and grow the number to meet the planning cycle. Otherwise, you're not lining or aligning your role as I don't want to say governor, but as the party representative for that area. You're not demonstrating your value and your contribution to the overall party's plan. And so, a lot of times, if things aren't going as you would like, you might obfuscate those numbers, inflate them in certain cases, because what's the alternative, right? Not good. So it is one of those things where, as the cycle and as this planning process, as Chris, you so aptly described, as it goes on and it's developed and it's approved by the CCP and the state, and it becomes this published record, really, of, hey, this is what we want, a public record of this is what we're aiming at. It really sets the course for the overall system to run. And again, things happen, things don't always pan out the way you plan. I think there's an excellent Scottish poet that has a line on this: best laid plans of mice and men, right? Oft apt agly, if you want to finish that one. But it is the lifeblood, really, of how it pushes forward. But I want to, because I think you covered it quite well there, Chris, I want to ask, so we've got 5-year plans. So we have the 13th, we've got the 14th, and obviously all the way back to number 1. Are there longer term plans as well, or are these really 5-year bites that we get?
I would say there are longer term plans. Those are 10-year plans. Build plans for larger aspects of industry, especially related to core strategic areas, MilCiv integration, military development. Those plans are about 10 years in length. Not widely publicized as the 5-year plans. For instance, the 14th 5-year plan was issued again in the 5th plenum of the 19th Party Congress, but it also took about 6 months. So if you're looking at open source reporting and your news all the way down to the local level, it took months for people to digest the 5-year plan. It's about 178 pages long, but then broken down into excruciating detail in some cases, as you mentioned. It takes a long time to process and to then allow down to the lowest levels to start building to reach those goals and achieve those goals. But for the longer plans, yes, they do that 10-year planning cycle for kind of larger national strategies.
Yeah, and I think I've seen them also reach out to 15 years in very specific cases, but with very little detail involved. So there is at least some aspect of longer term planning, though I don't, not necessarily 50 plus years if we want to, discuss that. But
yeah,
go ahead.
The first 5-year plan came out in 1953. Before that, and even going back to the founding of the Communist Party in 1921, their plans were very, very limited and focused on in survival mode at that point in both the Civil War time period with the in China and also in the fight against Japan, World War II, and that type of planning was very not focused so much on bringing all the economic forces together to build a nation. It was much more focused on party building at the time and expanding capabilities of the PLA to fight in that Civil War and the war against Japan, as they would term it. But after 1953, this becomes kind of the central guiding mechanism for their planned economy. And it was very detailed at the beginning, but now it's become more guidance than a blueprint, but it is still a core mechanism for their economic planning.
And you mentioned terminology changed, right? The actual term that in Chinese that they use.
Yeah, up until the 11th 5-year plan, they would call it a Wunian Jihua, which was 5-year specific plan. And after that, after the 11th, they changed it to Wunian Guihua, which is kind of a broader strategic guideline of planning process in terms of building more focused on planning and coordination and evaluation. So they go through that evaluation of how are they doing in this 5-year plan, and they report back to the NPC on how each sector of the economy is doing in that process.
All right, and I know we've gone quite long, so if you're still listening to this, I appreciate you for sticking around. There's been a lot of good stuff we've covered. And Chris, the last thing I want to say about the 5-year plan concept is that as the plan is written and put into practice, as you mentioned, some of this is very broad, and there are specific study groups that are put together at different levels of organization to dive in and then figure out their answer, right? If the drive is you've got to develop smart technology, then their job is to figure out, oh my gosh, what does that mean for us, right? What does that mean, my contribution or our organization's contribution to smart tech? And we see that reflected a little bit, specifically in the PLA, when we're looking at things like the term informationization or intelligentization, which we will dive into further in a different episode of this podcast series. But trying to, much like in the US, when there's some very sexy term and policy that everybody's like, I want a bite of that, they're trying to figure out ways to actually get involved. And obviously in the Chinese context, it gets a little bit more concrete depending on what area you're in. But I want to, kind of wrap up this episode. The first thing I want to ask, I got 2 more real questions for you, Chris, is what, after this conversation today and really putting together some of the really interesting and need to know details on the CCP, the PRC, and the PLA and how it all works today, what are some of the big takeaways, or maybe one big takeaway that you've got for our audience that you really want them to leave this conversation with?
I would say the key takeaway here is that the party really its core function is to organize and mobilize, and it does through all the systems of governance, from state to military to the economy. And so, keeping that in mind, that every decision that's made in how they develop their military forces, how they develop their economic strategies, how they build, they do their Belt and Road strategy, it all ties to central party planning and central party organization and mobilization. And the party has the capability to mobilize, even though it doesn't necessarily represent, but it has the capacity and the capability to mobilize a great deal of the population of China to achieve these goals and objectives in each of these planning periods.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent takeaway and very well said. Thank you. So I want to give you a chance now too. I mentioned, pick as much time as you want on this, but what are some of the big things that you're working on? Maybe something you want to share with the audience, or anything else that you've got that you want to go and share.
Thank you. And I will say I'm working on a paper right now. I'm working on developing how China is managing their strategic and innovative technology development through MIL-SIV integration, and looking specifically at organizations within the State Council and, of course, with the party in there as well, how they're building innovation, how they're building strategic systems, how that's being coordinated internally. And that's a lot of work because China, it's a difficult environment to understand. I will say a few months ago, Zhang Youxia gave a speech on the status of the military developments under the 14th five-year plan, highlighting Chapter 56, the modernization of national defense and military to improve the military strategic systems in the new era. And in that, he talks about how they're developing their strategic, innovative, and disruptive technologies to accelerate the upgrade of weaponry and equipment. So that's kind of my focus area. So looking at what they're actually doing in their 14th five-year and what are they going to be doing in their 15th five-year plan.
Yeah, because that 15th is coming up, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today. I know I always enjoy my conversations with you, and I hope that our audience can get some valuable lessons out of today's conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy man, so thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Dan, for coming here, and I really enjoyed discussing this with you and look forward to doing more of this in the future. So thank you again.
Thank you. Over to you, Kiwi.
And also thank you to all the folks who's going to join us in the future on Spotify or your podcaster of choice on YouTube. That's all we have for this episode, so go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.